Hello everyone, and thank you for your interest in the RCL Open Education Grant that River Campus Libraries is piloting this summer. This grant has been a priority for a group of librarians working on open education initiatives for the past few years. The members of the grant team include librarians from the humanities, social sciences, and STEM. I'm Stephanie Barrett and am the representative of the group for this presentation. Other team members include Eileen Daly-Boas, Kim Hoffman, Pauline Schwartzman, and Allegra Tennis. I'll start with a little background for this grant. Open educational resources have become widely used as free or low-cost alternatives to textbooks and other course materials, some of which can be incredibly expensive for students to purchase. An OER is any kind of teaching material, including text, video, audio, images, or interactive content, that can be freely used, revised, and remixed. The adoption of OER creates a more equitable learning environment for students by making course materials more accessible. In the wake of COVID-19, the need for accessible learning materials has become even more apparent as the move to online learning has left many students without access to traditional textbooks and other course materials. The use of open pedagogy practices in the classroom creates opportunities for students to be more engaged and empowered. They have the chance to become active contributors to the creation of learning materials, which can be made openly available to the public or not. The purpose of this grant is to fund and aid in the creation, adaptation, and publication of OER and to support the adoption of open pedagogy practices. Goals for this project include creating a more equitable learning environment by reducing the cost of course materials and increasing online accessibility. We want to provide library support to instructors who want to create openly licensed course materials by helping locate existing OER content, or advising on licensing through Creative Commons or identifying appropriate and relevant repositories for your OER. We also want to empower students as co-creators of course materials through open pedagogy practices. Another goal is to help grow UR as an active contributor to the open education community. Studies have shown that openly licensed learning materials have equivalent or better student outcomes with the added benefit of being free or low cost for students. Lastly, we want to celebrate instructors who have adopted OER into their courses through initiatives such as Zero Cost Heroes, which is a campaign we started during Open Education Week this past spring. We don't have very many eligibility requirements for this grant pilot. We want to ensure that course instructors are included, but also those who do so much to support student learning on River Campus, such as staff in CETL. So, funded projects must be related to a credit-bearing course, or projects must support student learning on River Campus. We'll get into the different tracks available for this grant on the next slides, but we are estimating the first 2 tracks should be implemented within 1 academic year, and tracks 3 and 4 should be implemented within 2 academic years. Track 1 involves relicensing an existing work into an OER and covers up to $200 per project. There are activities that may need to occur within this track, such as investigating Creative Commons licensing and preparing associated files for reuse. An example of a Track 1 project would be taking a series of lessons that you already use and relicensing them as OER and uploading them into an appropriate OER repository to make them more findable and to benefit others. Track 2 involves creating videos, modules, and/or adapting an existing OER textbook for your class and covers up to $800 per project. An example of this is adapting an existing open math textbook and adding new problem sets to go along with each chapter. Track 3 involves redesigning a course to include open pedagogy practices and covers up to $1,500 per project. Possible activities for this track are much more varied than the previous tracks and include different ways to include open pedagogy in the classroom, whether it's for a specific assignment or an entire course. An example of this would be creating an assignment for students where they would be the ones developing lesson plans and activities that deal with local history, causes, or traditions. A significant amount of work would need to go into such a project to ensure students are properly scaffolded and prepared for such an assignment. Track 4 involves creating a new OER book or textbook, either from scratch, by remixing an existing work, or a combination of those. This covers up to $4,000 per project. I'd like to take a moment to go through some of the requirements for this grant. First, projects will need to be openly licensed either through Creative Commons or its equivalent. For Track 3 projects where open pedagogy practices are used, you will also need to abide by FERPA, which is something the library can advise you on. CC licenses consist of a combination of different individual licenses. Attribution, commonly known as CC BY, is where you must give appropriate credit and provide a link to the license indicating if changes were made. You may also do so in any reasonable manner, but not in ways that suggest the licensor endorses you or your use. For non-commercial or NC, the material cannot be used for commercial purposes. For share alike or SA, if you remix, transform, or build upon the material, you must distribute your contributions under the same license as the original. No derivative works, or ND, means that if you remix, transform, or build upon the material, you may not distribute the modified material. Since remixing is a key component of OER, this license is not appropriate for this grant. On the right are some of the most common combinations of Creative Commons licensing, sorted from most to least free. An RCL librarian is more than happy to help you choose which one might be right for you and your project. Beyond open licensing, there are additional requirements and expectations related to the work funded by this grant. Funded work must be deposited into our institutional repository, UR Research, and one additional OER repository. The grant group can help you identify specific repositories where your work may get the most exposure or where the subject matter is most relevant. We also want to ensure materials meet relevant accessibility standards and are easily edited. For example, if your grant project is to release a video, you'll need to provide files such as the MP4 as well as the original PowerPoint you're using for that presentation. Another requirement of this grant is that your work should be disseminated with the University of Rochester community. River Campus Libraries has existing venues to highlight such work, such as Zero Cost Heroes. However, you are not limited to opportunities provided through the libraries. To apply for a grant, the best place to get started is at our dedicated grant program page, library.rochester.edu/services/open/grant. We will begin accepting applications on June 25th and will continue to do so on a rolling basis through the summer and even into the academic year until our funds are completely encumbered. There are 4 main areas of review to consider within the grant rubric, which is easily found on the grant webpage. These major categories and finer subsets will be shared openly so that applicants can see what is expected through the grant process, and the OER working group members will adhere to the same standards as we begin our evaluation of applications. Project ideas will be broken into 3 smaller categories. Novelty. Is this project something new that will add to existing OER? Need. Similarly, is the OER content that you propose needed and going to fill a gap within your disciplinary area? Student immersion. And for the open pedagogy projects in particular, to what extent will your students be involved in the process of content creation? For the clarity of ideas within your grant proposal, the review board will want to clearly understand the goals, plan of attack, and intended impact of your project. If these things are not immediately obvious to your reviewers, there may be some back and forth where we ask further questions to gain a clearer picture. The level of dialogue can be beneficial as we address unanswered questions together, but it can also hold up decisions on awarding the grant funds. Is your project feasible? Meaning, have you estimated an appropriate amount of time and effort to complete your desired end result with the expected timeline? Will you overtax yourself by being too ambitious and in the end abandoning your project? And have you considered the necessary supports to help you get the work done? In these cases, sometimes less is more. OER and OP work can be a growing addiction due to the increased benefits you see within your students, and honestly, the things you learn about yourself as a teacher. You should be realistic about how much you can do now versus what you can add on later. Finally, to meet some of the key goals of this grant program, we'll be invested in the overall impacts of your project, both on a national level through sharing your OER in repositories, as well as on a local level. How many students have benefited from your OER OP work, whether it's economically, socially, or educationally? And to what extent did they learn and become immersed in learning the content, as well as tangential 21st century skills like teamwork, leadership, communication, empathy, etc.? If you have any questions about this grant opportunity or the application process, a team of librarians is available to help you with ideas, clarify the impact your project can make, and offer reasonable support through the project proposal phase. Members of the Open Ed grant team can offer informational resources regarding OER, OP, Creative Commons licensing, including past examples and repositories for idea generation, not to mention helping you avoid duplication of ideas. We can assist in refining your proposal while answering grant-related questions and navigating support that can either be tapped into through the library or the instructor's connections. Finally, as open access and OER can sometimes be confused, we can help you clarify what will be eligible for this particular grant. With or without the Open Ed grant team, your subject librarian can help brainstorm different ideas, assist in scaffolding, and adding time parameters to tasks and milestones, as well as offer scheduled librarian intervention in the classroom where appropriate. A combination of the Open Ed grant team, your subject librarian, and our scholarly communications librarian can help navigate the understanding of CC licenses, FERPA, as well as referrals to university council and more. Here is a brief overview of the grant process for all approved proposals. I'll go into each of these a little bit more detail in the following slides, but I found it helps to see an overview. As mentioned before, we will begin accepting grant applications on Friday, June 25th. There is no official closing date, and subsequent submissions will be reviewed on a rolling basis. For the pilot of this funding opportunity, River Campus Libraries is providing a total of $10,000. The amount of projects we fund will be dependent on the types of submissions we receive and which tracks applicants wish to pursue. On Friday, July 16th, the first successful applicants will be notified of their award. At this time, rolling submissions will be reviewed within 2 weeks of their submission. Once you've been notified that your project has been funded, you'll be contacted by the grant team to set up a meeting that will include at least one member of the team and possibly your liaison librarian. Here we will discuss any questions you may have regarding the grant process. We'll review the application and deliverables you've identified. We will also ensure you will have access to any additional information you may need for the next steps in the grant process, as well as any supports you may need for your project, such as information on Creative Commons licensing, where to find existing OER, or facilitating connections to other departments of the library, such as digital scholarship or the iZone. I'll reiterate that you are not alone in this, and we can help with any questions you may have. The next step is scoping the project by preparing an implementation plan, then signing the MOU. The MOU will be pretty standard, laying out the roles and responsibilities for the awardees and River Campus Libraries as they relate to the grant-funded project. The implementation plan will be included as an addendum to the MOU, and this is where you will identify specific milestones and related timelines for the grant project. Within the implementation plan, we'd also like to know how you plan on assessing the grant funding project. How will you gauge success for your project? What methods will you use to determine student learning outcomes or the impact of the project on the OER community? This section of the implementation plan will be highly variable and dependent on what your project is. This should culminate in a brief report to be shared with RCL. Upon submission, the MOU will be reviewed within 5 business days. You'll be notified if the MOU is approved as is, or if further clarification may be needed for your implementation plan. When it comes to payments, the grant funds will be split in half. You'll receive the first payment within 5 business days of MOU approval. You'll receive the second half of payment upon completion and approval of the final assessment report. The timeline for the second payment can vary greatly for these projects. For tracks 3 and 4, the second payment may not occur until the following academic year or later, since these projects are more time-intensive and may take longer to plan and implement. Thank you for your time. If you have any additional questions, you can always contact the Open Ed Grant team at rclopenedgrant@library.rochester.edu. You can also join us for the virtual Q&A session we'll be holding on Tuesday, June 15th if you have any further clarifications or questions on the grant itself or the grant process.